She walked into that cafe thinking she just needed coffee. She walked out with a target on her back, and the only man dangerous enough to stand between her and the people trying to destroy her was a mechanic who hadn't touched a weapon in 6 years. Damian Cross didn't just want her company, he wanted to break her, publicly, permanently. And he almost did. What he didn't account for was the quiet man in the corner, the one nobody looked at twice. That was his first mistake, and his last. If this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now because every week we bring you stories that will keep you up at night. Smash the like button if you're already hooked, and drop a comment telling us what city and country you're watching from. We want to see how far this story travels. Don't go anywhere. This one goes deep. The rain had been falling since before sunrise, the kind of slow, indifferent Seattle rain that doesn't announce itself, just settles in and stays. By 7 in the morning, the streets near Capitol Hill were already slick dark, and the coffee shop on the corner of Melrose and Olive, a narrow, wood-paneled place called Grounded, had fogged up its windows from the inside heat. Sophia Whitmore pushed through the glass door at 7:14 a.m. and immediately felt the tension leave her shoulders. Not completely. It never left completely anymore. But enough. Just enough. She was 30 years old, and on paper she was one of the most powerful women in Pacific Northwest tech. CEO of Whitmore Systems, a cybersecurity firm she had taken from a 4-person startup in her apartment to a company with 412 employees, an evaluation that made people at industry conferences either very eager to shake her hand or very reluctant to make eye contact. She had been profiled in 2 national magazines in the last 18 months. She had testified before a Senate subcommittee on data privacy. She had been called a visionary by people who made their careers deciding which founders deserved that word. What those magazines didn't photograph was the face she made at 2 a.m. when she was alone in her office reading the latest set of anonymous tips that had been circulating through the investor community. Tips that weren't true. Tips that were carefully, deliberately constructed to look like they might be. What they didn't capture was the way her hands shook sometimes when she signed documents now, not from nerves exactly, but from the specific exhaustion of someone who had been fighting the same battle for 4 months and still couldn't see the end of it. She ordered a medium dark roast, no room, and took the small table nearest the window. She set her bag down. She pulled out the folder she'd been carrying since the night before. Printouts of the latest round of fabricated investor communications that her legal team had flagged. And then she stared at it for about 15 seconds before turning it face down on the table. Not yet. 5 minutes. She was giving herself 5 minutes. The cafe was quiet at this hour. A barista with a sleeve of tattoos was restocking the pastry case. 2 women in scrubs sat by the door, one of them asleep sitting up. A man in the far corner booth was working on something, his coffee barely touched, his attention directed entirely at the table surface in front of him. Sophia noticed him the way you notice furniture. Registered, then forgotten. She wrapped both hands around her cup and let herself breathe. She thought about her father, which she tried not to do at work, but which happened anyway, especially on mornings like this. He had started the company with a whiteboard and a second-hand server rack, and an obsession with network security that most people in 2003 considered eccentric at best. He had died when Sophia was 24, 2 years into her MBA, and he had left the company to her because he believed she was the only person who understood what he was actually building. Not just a product, a philosophy, the idea that privacy wasn't a luxury. It was a right, and it could be protected. She had spent 6 years proving he was right to trust her. 6 years of difficult decisions and missed personal milestones and conversations she'd rehearsed in the mirror before having them in boardrooms. She had grown the company. She had been careful. She had been patient. And then Damian Cross had decided he wanted what she'd built. She heard the door open and didn't look up. The sound of expensive shoes on old hardwood. 2 sets, then a third. The particular energy that enters a room when someone powerful walks in and knows it. She looked up. Damian Cross was 51 years old, silver-haired, and built like a man who had been told his whole life that rooms belonged to him. He wore a charcoal suit with no tie, a deliberate casualness that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He was flanked by 2 men she recognized, assistants or security. It was hard to tell with Damian, he preferred the ambiguity. And he was already scanning the room with the particular look of someone who considered every space a stage. His eyes found her, stopped. She watched the corner of his mouth move. Not quite a smile, He said something to the man on his left without breaking eye contact with her, then walked toward the counter. She turned back to her coffee. Her jaw was tight. She made herself loosen it. He ordered something she couldn't hear, then turned around, cup in hand, and walked not toward the door but toward her table. She had known he would. That was the thing about Damien. He had never once in his life let a room decide what happened. He decided. Sophia. He said her name the way you say a word you're tired of spelling. Damien. She didn't stand up. She didn't smile. I wasn't aware this was your neighborhood. It's not. He pulled out the chair across from her without asking and sat down. His two associates positioned themselves behind him with the practiced discretion of people trained to be invisible and threatening simultaneously. I was in a meeting 2 blocks east, saw the sign, thought I'd see what the locals were drinking. He glanced at her cup. Dark roast. No fuss. That tracks. I'm not going to invite you to sit. You already did that. So let's skip the small talk. Sure. He leaned back, easy, comfortable, like he had all morning. How's the board? My board is fine. Is it? He tilted his head slightly. Because I had lunch with Raymond Cho on Thursday. He seemed uncertain about a number of things. Raymond Cho was her longest tenured board member. He had known her father. He had voted for her appointment as CEO unanimously and without hesitation. The idea that Damien had been sitting across a table from Raymond, that he had been working Raymond, made something cold move through her chest. Raymond is always thoughtful, she said carefully. That's why I value him. Sure. Damien picked up someone else's abandoned sugar packet from the table and turned it over in his fingers. I just wonder if thoughtful is the right energy for what you're facing right now. You need decisive. You need experienced. You need someone at the helm who investors can look at and feel. He made a small gesture, vague, dismissive, settled. Someone like you. I'm just talking, Sophia. You're never just talking. He smiled at that, genuine almost. You know what I've always respected about you? You're sharp. You really are. Your father built something real, and you understood it well enough to hold it together for, 6 years now? That's not nothing. But running a company during a scandal is a different skill set. He set the sugar packet down. These rumors that are floating around, the ones about the security breach, the ones about the Vantage contract, those don't just disappear because they're untrue. You know that. You've been in this long enough to know that narrative is everything. Sophia looked at him directly. You've been in this long enough to know that's not a passive observation. You're telling me you have something to do with those narratives. I'm telling you that someone with connections could make them stop. And someone with connections started them. The smile didn't waver. I'm an investor, not a publicist. I can't control what people say. You absolutely can. Her voice was even. She was proud of that. You've been doing it for 20 years. You made Marcus Hale disappear from the Trident board in 6 weeks by feeding 3 journalists a story that was 60% true and 40% yours. I know how you work, Damien. I knew before you sat down. So let's be honest with each other for once and talk about what you actually want. Something shifted in his expression. The easy comfort thinned out. Underneath it was something harder and less patient. What I want, he said, is access to the Sentinel protocol, the technology your team has been developing for the last 3 years. You know what it's worth. The government contracts alone are not available to you. Everything is available to someone. Not this. She leaned forward slightly. She kept her voice low, but she let the steel into it. The Sentinel protocol was built on a specific philosophy. It was built to protect privacy, not to commoditize it. Whatever you're planning to do with it, military contracts, surveillance licensing, foreign government sales, that's not what my father built this company for, and it's not what I'm running it toward. Your father. Damien said it gently, and that gentleness was worse than mockery would have been. Your father built a good small company. You scaled it. Both of those things are true. But there's a ceiling on what idealism can achieve in this industry, and honey, he paused on that word, watching her face, you're about to hit it. The cafe had gone quiet. Not silent. The espresso machine still hissed, the refrigerator unit still hummed. But the 2 women in scrubs had stopped talking, and the barista had found something to do near the far end of the counter that kept him turned away. The specific silence of people deciding not to witness something. Sophia pushed her chair back slightly. I think we're done here. I think you should listen to me for 2 more minutes. I think you should stand up and walk out. He didn't move. His two men didn't move. And then Damien reached forward and with one deliberate sweep of his forearm, knocked her folder off the table. The printed pages scattered across the wet floor, fanning out under the neighboring tables, some of them soaking up the tracked-in rainwater that had gathered near the door. The sound of it was small. The meaning of it was not. "Oops," Damien said. Sophia looked at the papers on the floor. She looked at him. She did not give him the reaction he wanted, which was visible distress, and she did not give him the reaction she wanted to give him, which was something she would regret. She sat very still. "Pick those up," he said. Quiet. Conversational. Like a request. "And then we can talk about what a managed transition of leadership might look like. Something clean. Something that protects your employees. Something that doesn't end with you being the story." "I'm not picking anything up." "Sophia," his voice sharpened, "don't make this harder than it needs to be. You're a smart woman. You can see where this is going. The board is nervous. Your key investors are getting calls that I guarantee you don't know the content of. 2 of your senior engineers have already been headhunted by firms I have a relationship with. This isn't a negotiation anymore. I'm offering you a dignified exit." "I'm not exiting." "You are." He stood up now, and when he stood, he was taller than she'd remembered, and the 2 men behind him straightened with him, and suddenly the table felt very small. "The only question is whether you do it with your reputation intact, or whether you spend the next 18 months fighting a war you're going to lose and come out the other side with nothing." She stood up too, because she was not going to let him be the only person standing. "My answer is no," she said. "It was no when you called my assistant in October. It was no when you sent Marcus Hale to my board in December. It's no now. It'll be no in 18 months. Write that down somewhere." His hand came out and closed around her wrist. Not violent, controlled. The way you grab a door handle, proprietary. "Think carefully," he said. "Right now. Think carefully about what your next words are." She didn't move. She didn't scream. She stood very still. And she looked at his hand on her wrist, and she thought very carefully, the way he'd asked her to, about what her next move should be. And she found that all of her calculations and all of her preparation for this moment had not actually accounted for the specific humiliation of being grabbed in a coffee shop while a room full of people looked away. Then she heard the sound of a chair scraping back, slow, deliberate. Footsteps. Unhurried. The man from the corner booth was standing up. She had clocked him when she came in the way she clocked everyone. A habit, not a conscious one. Work boots that had been repaired, not replaced. Jeans with a grease stain along the right thigh that hadn't quite come out in the wash. A dark green canvas jacket, worn thin at the elbows. 37, maybe 38. A face that had some mileage on it, not from hardship necessarily, but from weather and decision, and the particular kind of tired that comes from carrying something for a long time without putting it down. He walked toward them without any change in his expression. Damien glanced at him. The glance was dismissive, automatic. Whatever this was, it would be brief. The man stopped about 3 feet from the table. He looked at Damien's hand on Sophia's wrist. He looked at Damien's face. He said nothing for a moment, then, "Let go of her arm." His voice was level, not loud, not aggressive. The kind of voice that didn't need volume to communicate that it was serious. Damien turned to face him fully. His expression was the expression of a man encountering something mildly inconvenient. "This is a private conversation, friend." "I'm not your friend," the man said, "and I didn't ask for context. Let go of her arm." One of the security men stepped forward. He was wide across the shoulders, practiced in the particular posture of men who get paid to be physically present, and he put his hand out toward the mechanic's chest. What happened next was fast and quiet and almost anticlimactic in its efficiency. The security man's wrist was redirected. His momentum was used against him in a way that required very little effort and resulted in him stepping sideways into the neighboring table, catching himself, and finding that his arm was now at an angle he hadn't chosen. He stopped moving. The second man started forward and then stopped when he saw that his colleague was being held still by someone who wasn't even breathing hard. The cafe was absolutely silent. Damien had gone still. His hand had released Sophia's wrist. She wasn't sure exactly when that had happened. The mechanic released the security man's arm. took one step back, adjusted nothing about his posture. "I think you three should leave," he said. Damien looked at him. For the first time since he'd walked into Grounded that morning, his face showed something unscripted. It lasted only a second. Then the composure came back, smooth and practiced, like a curtain being drawn. "We'll continue this," he said to Sophia. "No," she said. "We won't." Damien straightened his jacket. He nodded to his men. He walked toward the door with deliberate unhaste, because Damien Cross had never rushed anywhere in his life, and he was not about to start in a Capitol Hill coffee shop. The door closed behind them. The mechanic turned back to where the papers had scattered across the floor and crouched down to start picking them up. He stacked them without looking at the content, tapped them into a roughened alignment, and set them on the table. Then he went back to his corner booth, picked up his coffee, which had gone cold, and sat down. Sophia stood at her table for a moment. Her wrist had a slight redness where Damien's hand had been. Her heart rate was doing something she was going to need to address. The two nurses near the door had gone back to talking quietly, and the barista had resumed whatever he'd been doing before. She looked at the man in the corner. He was not looking back at her. He had pulled out a small notebook, not a phone, an actual spiral-bound notebook, and was writing something in it with the focused attention of someone who had decided the drama was over, and he was done participating in it. She picked up her folder. She sat back down. She stared at her coffee, which was also cold. She had seen people handle physical confrontations before. She had male colleagues who took Krav Maga classes and liked to demonstrate things at company retreats. She had met veterans at fundraisers, men who wore their history in the way they scanned rooms and positioned themselves near exits. What she had just seen was not that. What she had just seen was the complete absence of performance. No posturing, no escalation, no look at me, no tell the story later. The man in the corner had stood up and addressed a problem and sat back down and was now writing in a notebook. And the whole thing had taken less than 90 seconds, and he was behaving exactly as if it had been as unremarkable as refilling someone's water glass. She looked at the grease stain on his jeans, the repaired boots, the worn jacket. She thought about the way his hand had moved, the angle, the economy of it, the complete and utter lack of hesitation. She turned back to her cold coffee and her scattered papers and the folder that Damien Cross had swept off the table, and she understood, not fully, not yet, but in the way you understand something before you have the words for it, that the most important thing that had happened to her this morning was not Damien Cross grabbing her wrist. It was a mechanic in a corner booth putting down his cup. Sophia sat with her cold coffee for another 4 minutes before she did anything. She was not the kind of person who acted on impulse. She had learned early, through a string of mistakes she didn't like thinking about, decisions made fast and paid for slow, that the space between stimulus and response was where you either kept your head or lost it. 4 minutes wasn't long, but it was enough to feel her pulse return to something normal, enough to look at the scattered papers she'd restacked and realize that 3 of them were out of order and she didn't care, enough to decide what she was going to do next. She left a 10 on the table even though her coffee had been $7.50. Then she picked up her bag and walked out. The rain had lightened to a mist. The street smelled like wet concrete and bus exhaust. She stood under the narrow overhang outside Grounded and looked left, then right, and saw him about 30 feet away near a beat-up dark blue pickup truck that was parked against the curb with one wheel slightly up on the concrete edge in a way that suggested the driver had been in a minor hurry when he'd pulled in. He was standing at the driver's side door, keys already out, his head down a little, the way people hold their heads when they're thinking about something that has nothing to do with where they're standing. "Hey," she said. He looked up. His expression didn't change much. She walked toward him. She stopped about 6 feet away, which felt like the right distance, close enough to talk, far enough to not crowd him. He had done her a significant favor, and she had not said a single word to him inside the cafe, which now struck her as a gap she needed to close, even if she didn't know exactly what she wanted to say on the other side of it. "I didn't thank you," she said. "In there. I should have." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I want to." She paused. "You didn't have to do that." "No," he agreed. She waited for more. He didn't offer more. He held his keys loosely in one hand, and he was looking at her with the patient attention of someone who understood that she was working up to something and was willing to wait, but was not going to help her get there. "What's your name?" she asked. A brief hesitation. Ethan. Sophia. She didn't offer her hand. Something told her that shaking hands wasn't the right rhythm for this conversation. You work around here? Other side of the hill, off Rainier. He glanced at the truck, then back at her. I come here on Tuesdays. It's quiet. Usually, she said. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile. The approximation of one. Usually, he agreed. She looked at him for a moment. The jacket, the notebook he had tucked back into his inside pocket. The way he was standing, weight distributed evenly, shoulders level, not leaning on the truck the way most people would lean on something when they were relaxed and waiting. He wasn't quite relaxed. He wasn't tense either. He was simply present in a way that felt calibrated. What you did in there, she said. The way you moved. That wasn't... She stopped, reconsidered how to say it. That's not something you learn at a gym. He looked at her for a moment, then he looked at the street. The guy grabbed you, he said. That's not complicated. For most people it is. Most people stayed in their seats. Most people had a reason to. His voice wasn't judgmental about that. It was just a statement of fact, delivered with the flatness of someone who had thought about it and arrived at an understanding rather than a verdict. He's obviously connected. You don't know who his people are. You've got a job, a family, maybe. Getting involved in something you don't understand the edges of, that's not cowardice, that's just sense. But you got involved. He looked back at her. Yeah. Why? He didn't answer immediately. He turned the keys over once in his hand and she watched him decide something, and when he spoke it was with the particular economy of someone who has learned the hard way to say only what they mean. Because he put his hand on you and you couldn't move, Ethan said, and everyone was watching and no one was going to do anything. I don't do well with that. I never have. It was honest in a way she hadn't expected. Not heroic, not dressed up, just a man describing a thing that was true about himself. The man who grabbed me, she said. Damian Cross. Do you know who he is? No. He's a venture capitalist, private equity. He's been building a position to take over my company for the past 5 months. She said it plainly, not dramatically, the way you state a medical diagnosis after enough time has passed that the shock of it has settled into something you just carry. He's been doing it by spreading false information, fabricated investor communications, planted stories in tech media, headhunting my engineers. He wants access to a specific piece of technology we've developed, and he's decided that the cleanest way to get it is to undermine me until my board loses confidence and forces a transition. Ethan was quiet for a moment. And what are you doing about it? Everything I legally can. My attorneys are documenting every communication we can prove originated from his network. My PR team is managing the narrative as best they can. I've been personally meeting with every board member and investor individually to maintain relationships. She stopped. It's not enough. He has more resources and he has more time and he doesn't care about the truth. He just has to make enough people uncertain for long enough. That's a very hard thing to fight with facts alone. Yeah, Ethan said. It is. She looked at him. You know something about that. I know something about being out-resourced, he said. Different context. The mist had picked up again slightly. Neither of them moved. I should go, he said. Okay. She reached into her bag and pulled out a card. Plain, white, the kind she kept for moments when she didn't want to hand over her full contact package, and held it out. If you ever want coffee that isn't ruined by someone like him, as a thank you. He looked at the card. He took it after a moment and put it in his jacket pocket without looking at it. I'll think about it, he said. He got in the truck. She stood on the wet sidewalk and watched him pull out, and she noticed that he checked all 3 mirrors before he moved and used his signal even though the street was nearly empty, and she couldn't have explained why that particular detail stayed with her, but it did. She stood there for a moment after the truck had gone around the corner. Then she took out her phone and called her assistant and told her to push the 9 o'clock meeting by 30 minutes. She had some thinking to do. It took her 3 days to find him. She had almost nothing. A first name, a truck she'd gotten a partial plate from, and a mechanic's shop off Rainier. Seattle had approximately 47 automotive repair businesses in that corridor, which she knew because she had asked her head of operations research, a meticulous woman named Dana Kress, who had once reconstructed a competitor's internal org chart from LinkedIn activity alone to see what she could find. Dana had come back in 22 hours with a name: Ethan Cole, 37. Sole proprietor of Cole Automotive Repair, a 4-bay shop on Rainier Avenue South that he'd been running for 4 years. Before that, nothing clean. A gap in the public record that Dana had described as unusual in a specific way, which was how Dana said something was deliberate without saying it was deliberate. Before the gap, military service. Honorable discharge, 8 years ago. Branch and unit not immediately apparent from public records. Dana had noted that the specific structure of the gap, the way certain records that should be routine were simply absent, suggested special operations or a related classification. Sophia had sat with that for a day. She had turned it over carefully, the way you turn over something fragile. She was not the kind of person who showed up uninvited in someone's workplace on the basis of a favor they'd done her in a coffee shop. She understood that Ethan Cole had very deliberately put his name on a garage and a truck and a Tuesday coffee routine and very deliberately left everything else behind him, and that what she was about to do was reach into that deliberate life and pull on something. She went anyway, because Damien had escalated. On the morning of the third day, she had arrived at the office to find that Marcus Hale, the same Marcus Hale, who had spent 6 weeks undermining the Trident board 2 years ago at Damien's direction, was waiting in the lobby of her building. He had a meeting scheduled with Raymond Cho and 2 other board members that her assistant had not been informed of. Someone had given him access to the building directory. Someone had scheduled that meeting using Raymond Cho's personal assistant, bypassing Sophia's office entirely. The meeting had lasted 40 minutes. Sophia had sat in her own office and waited, because walking in would have looked like panic, and panic was the one thing she could absolutely not afford to show right now. When Raymond emerged and came to her office, his face had the particular look of a man trying to be reassuring and not quite achieving it. He made some claims, Raymond had said carefully. Some of them were... Sophia, I have to be honest with you. Some of them were specific. What kind of specific? He said there's a security vulnerability in the Sentinel protocol. He said your technical team has known about it for 3 months and hasn't disclosed it to the board. She had looked at Raymond for a long moment. That's not true. I believe you. And he had said it in a way that felt like he meant it, and also in a way that meant he was going to need to verify it, which was the reasonable thing to do, and which also meant that the next 2 weeks of her life would be spent in documentation review and emergency technical audits instead of the actual work of running her company. She had driven to Rainier Avenue that afternoon. The shop was exactly what you'd expect. A converted auto body space, 2 roll-up doors both open to the gray afternoon, the smell of motor oil and metal, and the particular chemical sweet scent of brake fluid. A radio somewhere inside was playing something country and low. A late-model Honda with its hood-up occupied one bay. In the second bay, partially under a Subaru wagon on a lift, a pair of legs in dark work pants extended onto a wheeled creeper. She stood at the entrance for a moment. A teenager, 16 maybe, with earbuds in and a push broom, appeared from the back and looked at her with the expression of someone who knew that a woman in a tailored coat standing at the edge of an automotive shop usually meant a complicated bill conversation. "Is Ethan Cole here?" she asked. "Yeah." The kid pointed with the broom handle at the Subaru. She walked over. She crouched down next to the lift. She could see him from the mid-chest up, or down, relative to his position, his attention fully on something above him, a wrench working at something she couldn't identify. "Ethan." The wrench stopped. A pause. Then he pushed the creeper out from under the car and sat up and looked at her. There was a grease streak along his left jaw that he wasn't aware of. His eyes did the thing she'd noticed in the cafe, which was take in the whole situation before settling. Door, kid with broom, her, the parking lot behind her, before landing on her face. "Ms. Whitmore," he said. "Sophia," she said. "You can call me Sophia." "How did you find this place?" "I have a good operations team." She paused. "I'm sorry for showing up like this. I know you didn't ask for any follow-up." He studied her for a moment. Then he stood up, wiped his hands on a shop rag that was already beyond the point where wiping did much good, and tilted his head toward the back of the shop. "Come in the back," he said. "I've got a chair that's not covered in hydraulic fluid." The back office was a generous term for a 10 by 10 room with a metal desk, a mini fridge humming loudly in the corner, a rolling chair, and a spare stool. On the desk was a half-eaten sandwich and a child's drawing, crayon, clearly, of what appeared to be a blue truck with a figure next to it, both rendered with the confident inaccuracy of a kid around 6 or 7. The figure next to the truck had a green jacket. Ethan caught her looking at the drawing. He didn't comment on it. He pulled the rolling chair out toward her and took the stool himself. "You have a daughter," she said. "Yeah." He said it in a way that closed the topic without being rude about it. She understood and let it go. She sat down. She set her bag on the floor and leaned forward with her elbows on her knees the way she sat when she was tired of performing composure, which she was. "He escalated," she said. Ethan waited. She told him about Marcus Hale, about the meeting with her board members, about the fabricated technical vulnerability claim. She told him about the investor calls she'd been hearing about secondhand, calls that were sophisticated enough that her attorneys couldn't prove their origin, but patterned enough that she was now certain they were coordinated. She told him that 2 of her senior engineers had been approached by headhunters in the past 10 days, and that one of them, a woman named Priya Anand, who had been at Whitmore Systems for 3 years and whom Sophia trusted completely, had come to her quietly and said that the approach hadn't been a normal headhunt, that the recruiter had asked specific technical questions about the Sentinel protocol's architecture during what was supposed to be a casual, exploratory call. She told him all of it. She hadn't told anyone all of it in one sitting because every conversation she had these days was with someone who was either a stakeholder or an employee. And with stakeholders, she had to manage alarm, and with employees, she had to project stability. It was the first time in 4 months she had simply laid it out for someone who had no investment in the outcome one way or the other. When she was done, Ethan was quiet for a moment. "What do you want from me?" he asked. "I don't know exactly," she said, and that was honest. "I know what you can do physically. I saw that, but that's not—" She paused, organizing it. "What I'm facing isn't a physical problem most of the time. Damien isn't going to be solved by someone who can restrain his security team. He operates in information and access and reputation. He's been doing this for 20 years and he's good at it, and I need—" She stopped. "I need someone who is not part of my professional world, someone who has no stake in any of the existing relationships, someone who can see things I might be too close to see." "You have a whole company," Ethan said. "You have attorneys, you have board members." "I might have board members who are already compromised. My attorneys can only move on what I can prove. My company has a leak somewhere. I don't know where, but the specificity of the information Damien is using tells me it's not coming entirely from external research." She looked at him steadily. "And all of those people depend on me to be certain and confident and managed. I haven't had an honest conversation about how bad this actually is since October." Ethan looked at the sandwich on the desk, then at the crayon drawing, then at her. "I run a 4-bay shop," he said. "I change oil. I fix brake pads. I help my daughter with homework at night. That's the whole thing right now. That's what I've got." "I know." "Whatever you saw in that cafe—" He stopped, looked at the window, which was a single pane of glass looking out onto the alley where a dumpster sat. "That's not who I am anymore. I made a decision and I've been keeping it. I understand that." "Do you?" He looked back at her. "Because you came to my shop. You found out where I work. That's not nothing." "No, it's not." She held his gaze. "I need help, and I believe you can help, and I'm asking. That's the whole of it. You can say no." He rubbed his hand over the back of his neck. He looked at the ceiling, which was a water-stained tile grid with one section replaced by a piece of plywood that didn't quite match. He looked like a man doing arithmetic on something that wasn't arithmetic. "What does Damien actually want?" he said finally. "Not the corporate version, the actual thing." She took a breath. This was the part she hadn't said out loud to anyone. The Sentinel protocol is an AI-assisted network security system. It's unlike anything currently on the market, not incrementally better, categorically different. The way it maps and anticipates breach patterns is, look, I'm not going to oversell it, but my technical team built something genuinely important. It's been in government evaluation for 8 months, she paused. Damien has a consortium of investors, foreign connected, at least partially. If he gets control of my company, the technology goes into a different pipeline. It stops being a privacy protection tool. It becomes a surveillance and intelligence apparatus. Governments, specifically governments that are not friendly to the same values the technology was built around, would pay extraordinary amounts for what he's trying to get his hands on. Ethan was still, very still. How many people work for you? He said. 412. And if he gets what he wants, half of them lose their jobs in the restructure. The other half spend the next 3 years working on something they didn't sign up to work on. And the technology gets deployed in ways that affect, it's hard to quantify. It's very hard to quantify. He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the radio in the shop shifted to something slower. A car passed on Rainier with its bass too loud and then faded. My daughter's name is Lily, he said finally. She's 7. She goes to Maple Hill Elementary. She has soccer on Thursdays, and she makes me watch cooking competition shows on Friday nights, even though I think they're the most stressful thing on television. He said all of this carefully, like he was establishing the terms of something. She's the only reason I came home from the thing that brought me home. Do you understand what I mean by that? Sophia looked at him. Yes. If I do anything, if I agree to help you with anything, it's not because I want to go back to what I was. It's because... He stopped. He picked up the edge of the shop rag on the desk and set it back down. It's because I still have a hard time watching people get hurt by people who know they won't be stopped. And that's my problem. I know it's my problem. It's not a problem, she said quietly. Yeah, it is. There was no self-pity in it, just accuracy. It's the thing that almost got me killed 3 times and got 2 people I actually cared about killed once. Caring about things that aren't technically your business is not a virtue. It's expensive. He looked at her. But here we are. Sophia waited. I'm not taking money, he said. I didn't offer any. I'm not disappearing for days. Lily comes home at 3:15 and I'm here. Understood. And if this becomes something that requires me to put my daughter at any kind of risk, I'm out. No exceptions, no negotiations, no, just this one time, I'm out. If it ever got anywhere near Lily, I'd tell you to leave before you had to ask. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once. Not dramatically. The way you agree to help someone move furniture. Practical, slightly reluctant, already thinking about the logistics. Tell me everything, he said. Not the version you told me. The version you haven't told anyone. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. This one was thicker than the one Damien had knocked to the floor, and it was organized in a way that suggested she'd put it together for this specific conversation and had been deciding for 3 days whether she was going to use it. She set it on the desk in front of him. He opened it. He didn't react to anything visible for a long time. The shop radio cycled through another song. The mini-fridge hummed. Somewhere in the main bay, metal rang against metal in a quick, precise sequence that meant the kid with the broom had found something useful to do. Ethan turned a page. He read carefully the way people read when they are not performing reading. No nodding, no visible reactions, just the quiet absorption of someone building a picture. On the 3rd page, he paused. This name, he said. He pointed. Victor Ashby. He's listed here as one of Damien's consortium contacts. Do you know who he is? A private defense contractor. He was sanctioned by the EU 3 years ago for arms brokering violations. Damien doesn't publicize the connection. Ethan looked at the name for another moment. Something moved behind his eyes that she couldn't read. I've heard that name before, he said. Not recently, but I've heard it. She waited. He closed the folder. He looked at the crayon drawing of the green jacket and the blue truck. He looked at the half-eaten sandwich that he'd probably been planning to finish before she'd shown up. Okay, he said. Here's what I need from you. He leaned forward and his voice was different now. Not harder, but more focused, the way a lens sharpens when you adjust it. And Sophia Whitmore, who had spent 6 years in boardrooms with people who radiated the confident authority of money and title and accumulated social permission, felt something she had not felt in a very long time sitting across a desk from someone. She felt like she was talking to someone who actually knew what they were doing. I need every communication you have from your board members for the past 6 months, he said. Not the formal minutes, the emails, the texts if you have them. I need the names of every investor who has called you with concerns since November, and I need you to tell me which ones you think were prompted and which ones you think were organic. I need the org chart of your technical team, who has access to what level of the Sentinel architecture, and for how long. And I need you to think very carefully about one specific thing. What thing? The leak you mentioned. The information Damien has that's too specific to be external research. He looked at her steadily. Someone in your building is talking to his people. That's not a theory. The pattern you just described makes it a fact. Whoever it is, they're not doing it because they're a bad person necessarily. They're doing it because Damien found their pressure point and pushed on it. Figure out who has a pressure point right now, who's scared, who's in debt, who got passed over for something, who's been different the last few months, and you'll find your leak. She sat with that for a moment. She had known it, somewhere in the part of herself she hadn't been letting speak too loudly. But hearing it said plainly by someone outside the situation made it real in a different way. That's going to be hard, she said. Most of this is going to be hard. He picked up the folder and handed it back to her. He stood up. She stood up. Come back tomorrow morning, early, before 8. Lily doesn't leave for school until 7:45. Okay. And Sophia, he looked at her directly. Stop telling people everything's under control. Not the specifics, don't broadcast that. But stop performing certainty you don't have. It's burning energy you need for other things. She looked at him. How do you know I've been doing that? Because it's what capable people do when they're scared, he said simply. And you're clearly both. She picked up her bag. She walked to the door of the back office. She stopped. Ethan, the name Victor Ashby. When did you hear it? He was quiet for a moment. In the silence, she could hear the radio from the shop floor, faint and tinny. A long time ago, he said, in a place that doesn't exist on any map I'm cleared to mention. She looked at him for a moment. Okay, she said. She walked out through the shop, past the Honda with its hood up, and the teenager with the push broom, and out into the gray Rainier Avenue afternoon. She sat in her car for a moment before starting it. Victor Ashby. Ethan had heard that name in a place that didn't exist on any map, which meant that whatever Damien Cross had built around himself, whatever web of money and leverage and foreign-connected investors and information brokers, it went deeper than corporate fraud. And the mechanic with the crayon drawing on his desk and the daughter who liked cooking shows on Friday nights had been inside that world before. She started the car. Tomorrow before 8, she would be there. She was there at 7:41. She had been parked on Rainier Avenue since 7:20, sitting in her car with a coffee she'd picked up from a drive-through 3 blocks south, watching the street lighten from gray to pale gray to something almost white. She was not someone who arrived early as a power move. She arrived early because she had not slept well, and lying in bed staring at the ceiling felt like a waste of the anxiety she was already paying for, and sitting in a car with bad drive-through coffee at least gave it somewhere to go. At 7:43, a school bus appeared at the end of the block and stopped. She watched Ethan come out of the side door of the shop building. There was a staircase on the exterior she hadn't noticed before, which meant he lived above the garage, which she absorbed without comment, with a small girl in a yellow rain jacket and a backpack that was slightly too big for her frame. The girl was talking. She was talking with her whole body, one arm gesturing at something, and Ethan was listening with the particular quality of attention that adults reserve for children when they're genuinely interested, and not just performing interest. He crouched down when they got to the sidewalk. He zipped something on her jacket that had come undone. The girl said something, and he laughed. An actual laugh, sudden and unguarded, the kind of laugh that didn't know it was being watched. And then the bus door opened, and she climbed in, and he stood and watched it pull away. He stood there for a moment after it turned the corner. Then he turned and looked directly at her car with the expression of someone who had known she was there since at least 7:30 and had decided not to comment on it. She got out. You could have come up, he said when she reached him. I didn't want to interrupt the morning. He looked at her for a moment. She would have liked you. She likes people who dress professionally. She's going through a phase where she wants to be a lawyer. He turned toward the side door. Come on. The apartment above the shop was not what she had constructed in her head. She had imagined something sparse and functional, a bed and a table and the minimum required infrastructure for a man who had reduced his life to its essentials. What she walked into was small but lived in a way that spoke of specific effort, a bookshelf along the whole left wall with books that had actually been read, their spines bent and in some cases taped, organized by some system she couldn't immediately parse. A kitchen table with 2 mismatched chairs and 1 smaller chair with a booster seat cushion still velcroed to it. On the refrigerator, drawings, a school schedule, a paper calendar with soccer practices marked in blue marker. The drawings were everywhere, actually. On the refrigerator, on the corner of the kitchen counter, held down by a coffee mug, one framed, actually framed in a real frame, on the wall near the window. That one showed a house with a very large sun and two stick figures, one tall and one small, standing in front of it. The tall one had what appeared to be a wrench. Ethan poured 2 cups of coffee without asking and set one in front of her at the table. He sat across from her. He looked like he'd been up for a while, but he was already in work clothes, the same kind of canvas jacket as before, a gray thermal underneath. "You didn't sleep," he said. "Not much." "Did you bring what I asked for?" She opened her bag and pulled out a flash drive and a printed summary she'd put together at 11 p.m. She'd debated the printed summary. There was something old-fashioned and slightly vulnerable about it, a document someone could lose or leave somewhere. But she had decided that Ethan Cole was not someone who needed to be managed, and that hedging information at this point was counterproductive. He took the flash drive and set it aside. He picked up the printed summary and started reading. She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. It was good coffee, which surprised her, and then she felt vaguely bad for being surprised. He read for about 7 minutes without speaking. She did not try to fill the silence. She had learned very quickly that Ethan occupied silence differently than most people. He didn't seem uncomfortable in it. He didn't perform thoughtfulness. He just read, and the room was quiet, and the rain had started again outside, and somewhere below them a compressor kicked on. "You're head of finance," he said finally. He didn't look up. "Daniel Reyes. How long has he been with you?" She blinked. 4 years. He came from Goldman. She stopped. "He's been with me through everything. He's one of 3 people who have full access to the financial projection models we used in the Sentinel Protocol investment case." "Does he have debt?" "I don't make it my business to Does he have debt?" Ethan said again, the same level tone. She closed her mouth. She thought about it. "His wife had a medical situation last spring. I don't know the details. He took 2 weeks of leave. He came back and he seemed fine, seemed normal. He didn't ask for anything." "People who are in over their heads on medical bills usually don't ask," Ethan said. "They find other ways." He set the summary down and looked at her. "I'm not telling you it's him. I'm telling you the profile fits and his access fits, and you need to look at his recent communications, not accusatorially, carefully." She absorbed that. The idea of Daniel Reyes, who had been present at every major board meeting, who had brought her homemade tamales at Christmas because his mother had taught him, and he was proud of them, who had cried quietly at the back of the room at her father's memorial service. The idea of Daniel was not something she wanted to hold. "I'll look at it," she said. He nodded. He picked up the flash drive. "I'm going to need your help understanding some of the technical architecture in here," he said. "I can follow financial structures and org charts and communication patterns. The Sentinel Protocol engineering documentation." He held up the drive. "I'm going to need a translator." "I can walk you through it." "Not all at once. I need to understand the parts that Damien would want most urgently. What does he actually need to make the technology work in the way you described? The surveillance application?" Sophia thought about it carefully. "The core algorithm, what we call the pattern engine. That's the piece. Everything else is infrastructure. The pattern engine is what makes the system different. It learns. It maps threat patterns in real time, and it adapts its response without human intervention. Applied to surveillance, to monitoring communications, or tracking populations, it would be extraordinarily powerful. It's the piece Priya Anand's team developed, which is why it matters that she was being asked specific technical questions during a headhunt. Is the pattern engine documented in a form someone could extract and sell? The documentation exists, yes, it has to, for patent purposes, for government evaluation, for internal training. It's in a secured partition of our system that requires 2-factor clearance. She paused. 3 people have access to that partition. Priya, our CTO, a man named George Latner, and Daniel. Ethan looked at her. "Daniel again," she said quietly. "Again," he said. She stared at the table. One of Lily's crayon drawings was on the edge. A purple horse with 6 legs, which she found oddly comforting in its pure commitment to its own logic. "Okay," she said. "Okay. Walk me through what you're thinking." He pulled the summary back toward him and turned it over, and she saw that he'd already written on the back. A small, tight handwriting, block letters, a list of names connected by lines. "Here's what I see," he said. Damien's operation has three tracks running simultaneously. First track is the reputation campaign, the false investor communications, the planted media stories, the board access via Marcus Hale. That's designed to create uncertainty from the outside. Second track is the board itself. He's working Raymond Cho and at least one other member, trying to create internal pressure for a leadership transition. Third track, he pointed to a name at the bottom of his diagram, is the technical extraction. He doesn't just want to take over the company, he wants the pattern engine documented and extractable before the takeover completes, because he knows that if the acquisition goes hostile, there will be a period of legal chaos during which a skilled technical team could lock the system down or restructure the documentation so it can't be easily transferred. Sophia stared at his diagram. You did all of this from the summary I gave you. I did it from the summary and from what you told me yesterday, and from about 40 minutes of thinking this morning while Lily ate cereal. He looked up. I'm not a miracle. I'm just someone who has spent a lot of time understanding how people build pressure campaigns. The targets change. The structure doesn't. The third track, she said. The technical extraction. If Daniel is the leak, then Damien already has partial documentation. The question is whether he has enough. Ethan tapped the paper. You need to know that before anything else, because if he has enough, the legal battle becomes secondary. He can proceed without the acquisition. He can take what he has to Victor Ashby's people and sell the underlying architecture while your attorneys are still filing motions. She felt cold. Not dramatically, not a cinematic shiver, just a specific lowering of temperature in her chest, the kind that happens when something you'd kept theoretical becomes actual. If that's true, she said, if he's already extracting, then you don't have 6 months, Ethan said. You might have 3 weeks. She looked at him. He looked back at her without flinching from it, which she appreciated and also found deeply uncomfortable. Okay, she said, then we move faster. We need to do one thing first, he said, before any of the rest of it. What? He folded his hands on the table. He had a cut on one knuckle, half healed, from something in the shop. He looked like he was deciding how to say the next thing. I need to tell you who Victor Ashby is, he said. Not who he is on paper, who he actually is. She waited. I spent 8 years as a Navy SEAL, he said. His voice was even but different, flatter, like a door closing. My last 3 years were with the Joint Task Force. We did threat disruption, not combat in the traditional sense. Intelligence-adjacent operations. We went into places that didn't exist, after people whose names were never in any public record, doing things that were never going to be explained to anyone. He stopped. My last mission was in the Black Sea region. We were tracking a network that was brokering stolen defense technology. Not weapons, hardware and software, proprietary systems that had been extracted from Western companies and were being moved east. She didn't move. Victor Ashby was a name that appeared 3 times in the intelligence package we were working from, Ethan continued. He wasn't the primary target. He was a facilitator, someone who made introductions, handled money movement, ensured that the right technology got into the hands of the right buyers without leaving obvious fingerprints. He was extraordinarily careful, the kind of careful that takes years to develop. He looked at the table. 2 members of my team were killed on that mission. We didn't complete the objective. The network dispersed. 6 months later, I was discharged and I came back here and I opened the shop and I decided I was done. Sophia realized she'd stopped breathing normally and made herself breathe. Ashby is still operating, Ethan said. If Damien's consortium includes him, this isn't a corporate raid. It's not about Damien wanting to add a piece of technology to his portfolio. This is about a network that has been operational for years trying to acquire a specific asset that they've identified as valuable. He looked at her directly. Your company is not the target. The pattern engine is the target. Damien is a buyer's agent. Ashby is the buyer. The rain on the window was steady and uninflected. Downstairs, the compressor had stopped and it was very quiet. Why would Ashby use Damien, she said. If he wanted the technology, why the corporate structure? Why the acquisition play? Because the pattern engine is currently under government evaluation. A direct theft attempt would trigger federal investigation. But if a domestic investor legitimately acquires the company through a board-authorized transition, the government evaluation gets paused, the legal structure changes, and the technology moves into a different ownership framework during the gap. Ethan's voice was exact. It's not faster than stealing it. It's cleaner. It's something that looks, on paper, like business. She thought about this. She thought about her father sitting at a whiteboard in a two-bedroom apartment 12 years ago, drawing network architecture diagrams with a black marker, talking about the obligation of people who understood systems to build them in a way that protected people instead of exploiting them. She thought about the 412 people who came to work every day in the building she ran. "What did Damien grab me for?" she said. "In the cafe. What was that actually about?" "I've been thinking about that." Ethan's jaw shifted slightly. "I think that was personal. I think he's been doing this long enough that he's become comfortable. He thought you were alone and defeated, and he wanted to feel it. The way that type of man always wants to feel it, in person, with an audience. That was a mistake on his part." "Yes," Ethan said. "It was." She looked at him. "Because of you." "Because of you too," he said. "You didn't give him anything. Whatever was going through your head, you didn't give him anything to use." He paused. "That matters. He came in looking for a woman who was breaking down, and he found someone he couldn't read. That bothers people like him more than opposition does." She absorbed that. She wasn't sure it was entirely true, but she was grateful for it. "Ethan," she leaned forward slightly, "what happened on your last mission? The two people who were killed?" His face did something complicated and then settled. "Why?" "Because I need to understand what I'm asking you to be involved in. If this connects back to what you were doing then, if Ashby is the same Ashby, he is, then this isn't just corporate fraud. This has history for you that it doesn't have for me, and I'm not going to pretend that doesn't matter." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the window. Outside, a car moved through a puddle, and the sound of it came through the glass, brief and wet. "Marcus Webb," he said finally, "and Jonah Reese. Marcus had 2 kids. Jonah was going to get married the following February." He stopped. "We walked into something that had been prepared for us. Someone on our intelligence chain had fed us wrong coordinates. We were in the wrong building, and the right building was 400 meters east, and by the time we understood what had happened..." He stopped again. "We completed what we could of the mission, and we extracted what we could of the team, and Marcus and Jonah did not come home." Sophia did not say she was sorry, because it would have been true but insufficient, and she sensed that Ethan had received insufficient sympathies on this subject and had developed a reasonable wariness of them. "The intelligence leak," she said. "Someone fed you wrong coordinates." "Yes." "Was that ever traced?" "Not officially." His voice was flat in a way that meant, "And that has been a thing I have lived with." "But you have a theory." "I have a name," he said, "and I've never been able to do anything with it because I'm a mechanic on Rainier Avenue, and the person I think is responsible operates behind 4 layers of legal insulation and has never been in the same country as anything that could be proven." She felt the pieces connect before she said it. "Ashby." "The leak on our intelligence chain had the fingerprints of someone who understood our protocols from the inside. And Ashby's network included, at that time, at least one compromised intelligence contractor. I can't prove it. I have never been able to prove it. But the reason I recognize that name in your folder," he looked at her, "is because I have been carrying it for 6 years." His apartment was very quiet. Outside, Seattle's gray morning pressed against the windows. Sophia sat with what he'd just given her. She understood now the specific weight of what it meant for him to be sitting at this table with her. It wasn't just that she was asking him to re-enter a world he'd left. She was asking him to re-enter it in proximity to the specific node of that world that had cost him the most. And he had said yes. Not because he was reckless, or because he had some death wish, or because the soldier part of him needed to be activated. He had said yes because he was the kind of person who could not, in the end, watch something happen when he had the capacity to stop it. That was, as he had told her himself, his problem. She was starting to think it was also his particular form of integrity. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Go ahead." "If we do this, if we actually build a case, if we go after Damien's operation all the way, the Ashby connection becomes relevant at some point. It becomes relevant to federal investigators, probably. It becomes relevant to people who operate in the space you left." She looked at him carefully. "Are you prepared for that? For your name to be in that conversation again?" He looked at his hands, the half-healed cut on his knuckle. "I need Lily to be safe," he said. That's not negotiable and it's not discussable. If there is ever a point where being involved in this creates a risk to her, I already told you. I know what you told me. I need to hear myself say it again. He looked up. If she's safe, then yes. I'm prepared for whatever that conversation looks like. I've been carrying this for 6 years and I'm tired of carrying it somewhere no one can see it. She nodded. Okay, he said. He pulled the printed summary back toward him and flipped it to the side with his diagram. Here's what we do. In the next 72 hours, you need to find out what Daniel Reyes has been doing. Not confrontationally. You cannot tip him off, because if Damien knows you're looking inward, the whole timeline accelerates. I need you to work with whoever in your IT team you trust absolutely and get me an access log for the Sentinel documentation partition. Every login, every file viewed, every download, even attempted ones. Can you get that without Daniel knowing? Yes. My IT director, a woman named Cass Freeman. She's been with me from the beginning. She's not in Daniel's orbit. Get Cass, get the logs, bring them here. I can have them by tomorrow afternoon. Good. He tapped the paper. Second thing, Marcus Hale. He's been Damien's delivery mechanism to your board. I need to know what leverage Damien has on Hale, because Hale is not doing this for money alone. Hale has a history with Damien that goes back 15 years. Something in that history created an obligation that Damien has been drawing on ever since. Find it. Your operations woman, Dana. Dana, can she work without leaving tracks? She's the reason Damien's investor communications haven't been traceable back to him yet. She works clean. Give her Hale, not the Damien angle. Give her Hale directly. Business history, legal history, anything that looks like it was settled quietly or had a record expunged. He paused. Third thing, the Vantage contract. The one you said Damien's people have been spreading rumors about. Tell me exactly what the Vantage contract is and why it matters. She took a breath. Vantage Defense is a government contractor. They're our largest client. They account for about 22% of our annual revenue. The contract is up for renewal in 60 days. If the rumors Damien has been planting create enough doubt about our leadership stability, Vantage might not renew. If Vantage doesn't renew, our revenue picture for the next fiscal year drops dramatically, which makes our board nervous, which makes our investors nervous, which makes the case for a leadership change easier to argue. So the Vantage contract is the structural pressure point, Ethan said. Everything else Damien is doing is designed to put enough weight on that point that it cracks. Yes. Who is your primary contact at Vantage? A woman named Helen Birch, Deputy Director of their Technology Acquisition Division. Do you have a personal relationship with her or a professional one? Professional, but good. She's been rigorous and fair throughout the evaluation process. I trust her judgment. Call her today, Ethan said. Not to defend yourself. Don't make it about the rumors. Call her and tell her you want to give her a confidential briefing on a security matter that affects the evaluation. Tell her you have information about an attempt to interfere with the government evaluation process from outside your company. Don't give her specifics yet. Just get the meeting. Sophia looked at him. About the extent of Damien's operation, you're not wrong, he said, and sitting on it while he finishes building the case against you is not going to make you more right. She sat with that. Then she nodded. There's one more thing, Ethan said. His voice changed register slightly. Not softer, but more deliberate. I need to reach out to someone. Someone from before. Yes. He said it without apology or elaboration. There are people I haven't spoken to in 6 years. People from the task force who are still operating, who would have current intelligence on Ashby's network. I need to know what his recent activity looks like, who he's been in contact with, whether there are other acquisitions or extractions in progress that pattern match to what he's doing with you. Reaching out to those people, she said carefully. Does that create risk for you? Different risk than I'm already in. He was honest about it, which she appreciated. Once I start moving on Damien's operation, Damien is going to notice. He has people who watch for exactly this kind of countermove. When he notices, he's going to try to understand who's helping you and why. At that point, having current intelligence on what Ashby knows and doesn't know about me becomes important. She understood what he was saying. He wasn't just helping her. He was also, 6 years late, walking back into the fight he hadn't finished. And he was doing it with clear eyes about what that meant. Do what you need to do, she said. He nodded once. She looked at the refrigerator, the drawings, the calendar, the soccer schedule in blue marker. She thought about a 7-year-old in a yellow rain jacket who wanted to be a lawyer and watched cooking competition shows on Friday nights. She's lucky, Sophia said. Lily. Ethan looked at the refrigerator too. His expression was something she couldn't quite name. Not sentimental, not uncomfortable. Somewhere between the two, in the specific territory of a person looking at the thing that keeps them honest. I don't know about that, he said. I work too much. I forget to buy the juice boxes she likes until she reminds me 3 times. I'm not good at the school event stuff, the classroom parties, the costume days. I always find out the day before. He paused. But I show up. Whatever else I don't do right, I show up. That's the thing, Sophia said quietly. That's the whole thing. He looked at her for a moment. Then he stood up, which meant the meeting was over, which was fine. She had work to do, and so did he. She gathered her bag. She walked to the door. Sophia. She turned. He was standing at the table, one hand resting on his diagram. Be careful with Daniel Reyes. If he is the leak, and I'm not certain yet, he's someone who got caught in something and made a decision he probably regrets every day. He's not your enemy. He's someone who was squeezed and didn't have anywhere to go. When this is over, remember that. She looked at him. You're very sure about human beings. No, he said. I'm very sure about pressure. Put enough of it on almost anyone and they'll crack. It doesn't make them villainous. It just makes them human. He looked at his diagram. The question is always who did the pressing. She walked down the exterior stairs into the gray Seattle morning. The rain was light, the kind that doesn't require an umbrella if you don't mind arriving slightly damp. She sat in her car for a moment before starting it. She had a call to make to Helen Birch at Vantage. She had a conversation to initiate carefully with Cass Freeman. She had 412 employees who were coming to work today in a building whose security architecture was possibly already compromised, and she was the only person those employees were counting on to make sure they had jobs next month. She also had, for the first time since October, something that felt less like a plan and more like a direction. The difference mattered. A plan could be picked apart, argued against, delayed. A direction just required moving. She started the car. 3 weeks, Ethan had said. Maybe. She pulled into traffic and drove north, and the city moved around her in its ordinary way, indifferent and alive. And somewhere on Rainier Avenue, a mechanic who had spent 6 years trying to leave his past in a place it would stay was picking up the phone to call someone he hadn't spoken to since the year everything broke. The access logs Cass Freeman pulled told the story in the driest possible language, which somehow made it worse. Cass had delivered them the next afternoon in a plain manila folder, sitting across from Sophia in the small conference room they'd used when Sophia needed to have conversations that didn't go into the calendar system. Cass was 44, compact, with reading glasses she pushed up onto her forehead when she was thinking hard, and pulled back down when she wanted to seem like she wasn't upset about something. The glasses were on her forehead when she handed over the folder. She pulled them down before she spoke. 41 access events to the Sentinel documentation partition over the past 11 weeks, Cass said. 33 of them are routine, Priya's team running documentation checks, George pulling architecture files for the government evaluation package, standard stuff. 8 of them are Daniel's, she paused. 3 of those 8 happened between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. Sophia opened the folder and looked at the log printout without speaking. He didn't download anything, Cass continued, or he didn't complete any downloads that our system registered, but he opened the Pattern Engine core documentation file 4 times in the past 3 weeks. Each session lasted between 40 and 70 minutes. Another pause. Sophia, the Pattern Engine documentation is 230 pages. You don't open a 230-page technical document at midnight to brush up on your finance knowledge. No, Sophia said, you don't. What do you want me to do? Sophia looked at the log. She thought about what Ethan had said. He got caught in something and made a decision he probably regrets every day. She thought about Daniel's wife's medical situation last spring, the 2 weeks of leave, the way he'd come back and been fine, seemed fine, which now in retrospect she understood was the behavior of a man who had made a terrible decision and was trying to bury it under normalcy. Nothing yet, she said. Don't change his access permissions. Don't say anything to him. Don't alter anything in the system that he might notice. She closed the folder. I need 3 more days. Sophia, 3 days, Cass. I know what I'm doing. Cass pushed her glasses back up, which meant she didn't entirely know what Sophia was doing, but was going to trust her anyway, which was its own kind of loyalty. Sophia took the folder to Ethan that evening. He read the log at the kitchen table while Lily ate dinner in the next room. Pasta with butter, Sophia gathered, from the smell and the running commentary Lily was providing to no one in particular about how the noodles were too long and needed to be cut. But she didn't want to ask because the scissors were in the drawer that was hard to reach. Ethan called back that she could use her fork to break them. Lily said that was not how you were supposed to do it. Ethan said it was one valid method. Lily was unconvinced. It was the most ordinary domestic exchange Sophia had witnessed in months, and she sat at the table feeling like she'd accidentally stepped into someone's real life and wasn't entirely sure she should be there. He photographed it, Ethan said, without looking up from the log. She looked at him. Cass said there were no downloads. There wouldn't be. If he's been coached, and Damien's people would have coached him on exactly this. He knows the system logs downloads. He wouldn't complete a transfer. He'd photograph the screen. Ethan tapped the log. 70 minutes on a 230-page document. You can photograph a lot of pages in 70 minutes if you've got a good phone and you're not trying to read. Just capture. He set the log down. He's been building a dossier. Damien probably has most of the pattern engine core documentation already. Sophia sat with that. Then we're out of time, she said. We're close to out of time. Ethan looked at her. Which is why I need to tell you what I found. He'd spent the previous 36 hours making calls. 3 of them, he'd told her, to people he hadn't spoken to since his discharge. He'd been sparse with details about those conversations, which she respected, but the results he'd laid out for her now in a series of handwritten notes that he smoothed flat on the table beside the access log. Victor Ashby moved $40 million through a shell network in the Cayman Islands 8 days ago, he said. The destination accounts are structured to receive a large asset acquisition. My contact can't tell me exactly what the acquisition is, but the timeline and the scale align with what Damien would need to fund a forced board transition and a subsequent IP transfer. 40 million, she said. That's what my contact confirmed, and that's what was visible. The actual figure is probably higher. He shifted the notes. Second thing, Damien has a meeting scheduled at the Meridian Hotel in downtown Seattle 4 days from now. Private meeting, booked under a corporate alias. But the security arrangements that were requested, the type, the number, matched the profile of a meeting where Ashby's representative would be present. Not Ashby himself, he doesn't travel into the U.S. directly, but someone with authority to finalize terms. A closing meeting, she said. A pre-closing meeting. They're going to confirm that they have what they need to complete the move against your board. If the pattern engine documentation is ready to transfer, they finalize the acquisition structure. If it's not, they accelerate pressure on your board to force a vote before you can stabilize. He looked at her directly. Either way, that meeting is where everything comes together for them. In the next room, Lily had apparently solved the pasta problem by some method she was now narrating with satisfaction. Ethan glanced toward the sound, the way he always did. Not worried, just tracking. And then looked back at Sophia. We have 4 days, she said. We have 4 days, he agreed. And the Vantage meeting? Tomorrow morning. Helen Birch agreed to a confidential briefing. I haven't told her specifics yet. Sophia looked at him. What do I tell her? Tell her everything, Ethan said. Not the Ashby angle, not yet, but the domestic piece, the fabricated communications, the board access via Hale, the documentation breach. Helen Birch is a government contractor's deputy director, which means she's spent 20 years watching people try to compromise procurement processes. She's not going to panic. She's going to want to verify, and she's going to want to act, and her acting is what gives you federal coverage. Federal coverage. If Vantage formally notifies their oversight chain that the evaluation process for a government technology contract has been subject to interference, that triggers a different kind of investigation than anything you can initiate privately. Damien can manage private legal pressure. He cannot manage a federal inquiry into interference with a defense procurement process. Ethan's voice was exact. That's the difference between fighting him on his terrain and forcing him onto yours. Sophia thought about this. She thought about walking into Helen Birch's office tomorrow and laying out 4 months of constructed deception in a way that was coherent and credible and not desperate sounding. She thought about this fact that she had been managing this alone, managing the image of managing it, for so long that the idea of actually putting it in front of someone with the authority to act felt almost foreign. "What about Daniel?" she said. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "After the Vantage meeting. Once you have federal coverage established, you can have a conversation with Daniel, but not before, and not in a way that tips Damien. If Daniel tells Damien, everything accelerates." "Yes." Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway with a plate that had been thoroughly cleared and the satisfied expression of someone who had made peace with their dinner on their own terms. She looked at Sophia with the frank appraisal of a 7-year-old encountering an adult in her kitchen for the second time. "You were here before," Lily said. "In the morning." "I was," Sophia said. "You were getting on the bus." "I know. I saw you from the window." Lily set her plate on the counter with the careful effort of someone who had been taught to do this and was still at the stage where the teaching was visible. "Are you and my dad working on something?" "We are," Sophia said. "Is it the kind of work he did before or the kind of work he does now?" The question landed in the room with its full weight. Sophia looked at Ethan. He was looking at his daughter with an expression she had not seen on him before. Something careful and open and slightly pained. The specific face of a parent encountering proof that their child understands more than they've been told. "It's a little of both, Ladybug," he said. Lily considered this with great seriousness. "Okay," she said finally, apparently having run some internal calculation and reached an acceptable result. "But you have to come to soccer Thursday." "I'll be there," he said. "Promise?" "I promise." Lily nodded, deemed this sufficient, and disappeared back into the living room. A moment later, the television came on. A cooking competition, because it was apparently close enough to Friday to begin the pre-ritual. Sophia looked at Ethan. "She knows more than you've told her." "Kids always do." He looked at the doorway Lily had gone through. "She was 3 when I came back. She doesn't have memory of before. But she feels the gap, I think. The shape of what's missing in the story." He was quiet for a second. "I'll explain it to her someday. When she's old enough to understand that people can be more than one thing without either of those things being a lie." Sophia thought about her own father, the whiteboard, the secondhand server rack, the obsession, the gap he'd left that was also a shape. "She will understand that," Sophia said. "I promise she will." He looked at her briefly, nodded once. "Get some sleep," he said. "The Vantage meeting is the most important thing tomorrow. Be rested for it." Helen Birch was 61 years old and had the demeanor of someone who had been promised chaos for 6 decades and had consistently delivered competence in response. She met Sophia in a private conference room at Vantage's Seattle offices at 8:30 the next morning, no assistants present, a notepad in front of her, a cup of black coffee she didn't touch. Sophia talked for 40 minutes. She had organized it carefully, not dramatically, not as a victim's account, but as a structured briefing, the way she imagined you'd present intelligence to someone whose job was to evaluate it. Timeline first, evidence second, implications third. Helen listened without interrupting. She made notes that were small and precise. When Sophia finished, Helen looked at her notepad for a moment, then looked at Sophia. "Victor Ashby," she said. Sophia had included the name with minimal context. Foreign-connected investor with a history of sanctions violations, allegedly part of Damien's consortium. "Yes," Sophia said. "I know that name," Helen said. Her voice was completely level. "Not from our division, from a briefing I attended 14 months ago." She closed her notepad. "Sophia, what you've described to me is not a corporate raider going after a technology company. What you've described is an active foreign acquisition attempt against a system currently under defense evaluation." "I know." "Which means this is not a conversation for my division." Helen picked up her phone. "I'm going to make 2 calls in the next hour. One to our legal team, one to a federal contact who handles procurement security. I need you to be available today. Not this afternoon, today, to brief those people." Sophia thought of Ethan. "That's the difference between fighting him on his terrain and forcing him onto yours." "I'm available," she said. The next 6 hours were the most exhausting of her professional life, which was a high bar. She sat across from 2 federal investigators, one from the FBI's Economic Espionage Unit, one from a division whose full name was never quite stated clearly, in a secure conference room at a federal building downtown, and she went through everything again. The fabricated investor communications, the board access via Marcus Hale, the Sentinel documentation breach, Damien's meeting at the Meridian in 4 days. The investigators were careful and thorough and revealed almost nothing about what they were thinking, which was professionally appropriate and personally maddening. They took everything she had. They told her she would hear from them by the following morning. She called Ethan from the parking garage. "How did it go?" he said. They took it seriously. She leaned against her car. She was exhausted in a way that sat behind her eyes. They didn't give me anything back, but they took it seriously. Good. A pause. That's the right outcome for today. Ethan. She pressed the back of her hand against her forehead. The Meridian meeting. In 4 days. They asked about it specifically. They asked if I had someone with intelligence-level knowledge of Damien's security arrangements. Silence on his end. I told them I might, she said. I didn't use your name, but they're going to want to talk to whoever has that knowledge. More silence. She could hear the shop below him, the faint sound of metal. Okay, he said finally. You don't have to. I said okay, Sophia. Not harsh, just firm. Set it up. She set it up. Ethan met with the federal investigators the next morning at a location they chose, not the federal building, a nondescript office suite in Bellevue that had no visible signage. Sophia drove him there and waited in the car. He was inside for 2 hours and 20 minutes. When he came out, he looked like a man who had gone somewhere he'd spent years not going and had come back from it intact but not unchanged. He got in the car and sat for a moment without speaking. How are you? She said. Fine. He looked at the windshield. They knew about Ashby, more than I expected. They've been building something against his network for a while. They didn't say how long. The Meridian meeting is, they called it an opportunity. He stopped. They want me inside. She turned to look at him. Inside the meeting? Not in the room. They want someone who can read the security arrangements, identify Ashby's representative if he shows, and confirm the structure of the meeting from the outside. They have their own people, but they want someone who understands how Ashby's network operates from direct experience. He looked at his hands. They were very polite about asking. They also made it clear they weren't compelling me, that it was my choice. What did you tell them? I told them I needed to think about it. He looked at her. Which I have. And the answer is yes. She looked at him. Marcus Webb had 2 kids, he said quietly. The older one would be about 13 now. I think about that more than I probably should. He looked back at the windshield. This doesn't fix that. Nothing fixes that. But doing nothing when I have the ability to do something, I can't keep justifying that to myself. She didn't say anything for a moment. I need to know Lily is somewhere safe that day, he said. Not her normal routine, somewhere different that Damien's people, if they're watching, won't connect to her. My assistant, Andrea, she has kids Lily's age. She lives in Ballard. Lily could spend the day there, so Andrea would be thrilled. She's been asking to meet her since I mentioned her once accidentally. The corner of his mouth moved. You mentioned Lily to your assistant. She came up in context, Sophia said, a little more defensively than intended. He almost smiled. Not quite. Okay, he said. Ballard. Thursday. Matt. The next 3 days moved in 2 different speeds simultaneously. Sophia's days were a compressed sequence of controlled normalcy. Board meetings attended, emails answered, appearances of stability maintained with the specific effort of someone performing calm while internally tracking a countdown. She had one interaction with Daniel Reyes that she would carry with her for a long time afterward. A Tuesday afternoon budget review where Daniel had been precise and professional and had laughed at something Raymond Cho said. A natural laugh, and she had sat across the table from him and understood with painful clarity that he was a good man who had done a bad thing under unbearable pressure, and that those 2 facts were simply both true and did not resolve each other. She met with Ethan each morning. The meetings had changed texture over the week. Less briefing, more collaboration, the 2 of them working through scenarios at the kitchen table while the coffee went cold, both of them circling the same information from different angles. She understood financial architecture and corporate maneuvering. He understood operational structure and human pressure points. The combination was, she thought, more than the sum of its parts. She also began to understand, in the particular way you understand things you haven't been told directly, some of what he'd been through before the garage and the kitchen table and the drawings on the refrigerator. Not from what he said, but from the gaps. The things he'd start to reference and then route around. The occasional moment where he'd describe something in terms that were too specific for someone who wasn't there, and then pull back into vagueness. He had seen things that she was not going to ask him to describe. He had made decisions in impossible conditions and carried the weight of them alone for years because the world he'd come from was not one where that weight was redistributed. She found herself thinking, more than once, that it was remarkable he was as steady as he was. And then she'd catch herself and recognize that steadiness had not been free and was not the same as wholeness. On Wednesday evening, she got the call from the federal investigators. They had confirmed the Meridian meeting. They had identified the security arrangement, and they had, through means they did not specify, confirmed that a man named Pavel Stroud, Ashby's primary North American liaison, a name that made Ethan go very still when she relayed it, would be present. "Stroud," Ethan said, "you know him." "He was at the edge of the intelligence package from my last mission." He stared at the table. "He was one of the names we didn't get to." She let that sit. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," he agreed. She drove home that night thinking about the cafe on Melrose and Olive, about sitting at a small table with a cold cup of coffee and a folder on the floor and a room full of people who had decided not to see what was happening, about a man in a corner booth who had decided differently. She had not walked into that cafe looking for help. She had walked in looking for 5 minutes of quiet, and instead she had encountered the specific kind of person who reminds you that the human capacity to actually choose, against self-interest and comfort and every reasonable argument for staying seated, is not common, but it is real. She thought about her father at his whiteboard, the things worth building, the people worth trusting. She had been alone in this fight for 4 months. She was not alone anymore, and the difference between those two states was something she did not yet have adequate language for. Thursday morning, she drove Ethan to Ballard first, where Andrea's house had a yellow door and 2 kids who came out to meet Lily with the immediate animal ease of children who haven't yet learned to be self-conscious about wanting company. Lily went with them without ceremony, which Sophia suspected was by design. Ethan had probably framed it as an adventure, not a precaution. He watched her go with the expression she was starting to recognize as his particular form of love, which was quiet and vigilant and entirely unglamorous. "She's going to be fine," Sophia said. "I know." He turned from the yellow door. He was dressed differently than usual. Dark clothes, nothing with visible logos, shoes that were broken in rather than worn out. "Let's go." The Meridian Hotel was a glass and steel tower in the Denny Triangle, the kind of building that prioritized the appearance of security over its actual execution, which Ethan had noted on their reconnaissance pass 2 days prior with the dry assessment of someone who had spent years understanding the difference. The federal operation had 3 teams in place by the time Ethan and Sophia arrived at the coffee shop across the street at 11:40 a.m. Ethan had a communication earpiece that connected him to the lead investigator, a deliberate man named Carver, who had the energy of someone who had run a lot of these operations and had stopped finding them exciting approximately a decade ago. "He's here," Carver said in Ethan's ear at 12:17. "Stroud, just entered through the lobby. Private elevator to 32. "Cross," Ethan said quietly. "Arrived 20 minutes ago. Same floor." Sophia sat across from him with a coffee she was not drinking. She had no role in the operational piece. She had made her contribution in the briefings, in the evidence she'd assembled, in the vantage trigger that had set all of this in motion. What happened now was not hers to manage. She found that harder than she'd expected, which told her something about herself she filed away for later consideration. "What's happening?" she said. "They're in the meeting." Ethan was looking at the hotel entrance across the street with an attention that was not tense exactly, but concentrated in a way that changed the quality of his presence. "Carver's team has audio on the room. Can you hear it?" "No, they're keeping that channel separate." He looked at her briefly. "This part is waiting." "I know." She looked at her coffee. "I'm not good at waiting." "No one is," he said. "People who say they are have just gotten better at pretending." At 12:54, Carver's voice came back. "We have what we need. Moving to detain." Ethan sat back slightly. He closed his eyes for approximately 2 seconds, which was the closest thing to an exhale of relief she'd ever seen from him. What happened in the next 40 minutes was not visible from the coffee shop. The Meridian's glass facade reflected the gray Seattle sky. People moved through the lobby in the ordinary way of people in hotel lobbies. Nothing that would appear on the evening news as a dramatic sequence. No shouting, no visible law enforcement surge, nothing cinematic. That was, she would later understand, entirely by design. Federal operations did not look like the movies. They looked like nothing at all from the outside while they dismantled everything from the inside. At 1:32, Carver said, "Cross is in custody. Stroud is in custody. The documentation package they brought to the meeting. It's there. We have it." Ethan looked at Sophia. "It's done." She stared at him. "What documentation package?" "Daniel brought a final package of Sentinel documentation to Damien yesterday evening. We knew he would." Cass flagged the access. "The investigators let it proceed because they needed the evidence of transfer to complete the case." He looked at her steadily. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you that part. Carver needed it to stay clean. If you'd known, it might have shown on your face in any interaction with Daniel." She thought about the budget review on Tuesday. Daniel laughing at something Raymond said. Her sitting across the table understanding that he was a good man who had done a bad thing. "He's going to lose his job," she said. "Yes." Ethan said it without dressing it up. "He'll probably lose more than that. He has a sick wife." "I know. That doesn't change what he did. It explains it. Those aren't the same thing." She looked out the window at the Meridian, at the glass that reflected the sky. "Victor Ashby," she said. "Stroud is his representative. Stroud in custody with documented evidence of a foreign coordinated technology acquisition attempt against a defense-evaluated system." Ethan paused. "That opens a different level of investigation. Ashby isn't untouchable. He's just been careful. Careful and untouchable are different things." She thought about Marcus Webb's kids. The older one would be about 13 now. "Will it be enough," she said, "to actually reach him?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. He looked at the hotel, at the reflected sky. "I don't know," he said. "Probably not immediately. Maybe not for a year. Maybe longer." He turned and looked at her. "But Stroud is the closest anyone has gotten to that network in 6 years. It's not nothing. It's not everything. It's not nothing." She nodded. Her phone buzzed. Raymond Cho. She looked at it for a second, then answered. "Sophia." Raymond's voice had a different quality than it had carried for weeks. "I just received a call from federal investigators. They're asking me about Damien Cross and a series of communications I received over the past 4 months." A pause. "I think I owe you an apology. Raymond, I should have come to you directly. When the pressure started, I should have come to you first. Instead, He stopped. "I got careful. And careful in the wrong direction. I'm sorry." She closed her eyes briefly. "We'll talk, Raymond. Not today, but we'll talk." She ended the call and sat for a moment. "Board members apologizing?" Ethan said. "Raymond Cho. He's a good man who got scared." She looked at Ethan. "Seems to be a pattern." "It's always a pattern." He looked at his hands. The half-healed cut on his knuckle had mostly closed. Damien's whole operation depends on finding good people at their most scared and making sure they have no one to turn to. Remove the isolation, the operation falls apart. It's never actually about the money or the technology. It's about convincing people they're alone. She thought about October, the first fabricated investor communication, the beginning of the long-managed performance of certainty she hadn't felt. 4 months of that specific aloneness. "We should go get Lily," she said. He looked at her. Something in his face shifted, back toward the ordinary, toward Ballard and yellow doors, and a 7-year-old who was probably currently showing 2 kids she'd just met the correct method for handling overly long pasta noodles. "Yeah," he said. He stood up. He put his jacket on. He was not a man who made exits into events. "Let's go." They walked out into the gray afternoon. The city moved around them in its ordinary way. The Meridian Hotel reflected the sky. Somewhere inside it, in a room on the 32nd floor, the thing that had been built carefully against her was coming apart in the hands of people whose job was exactly that, coming methodically, piece by piece, apart. Sophia Whitmore walked down a Seattle sidewalk next to a mechanic who had spent 6 years trying to leave his past somewhere it would stay, and neither of them said anything for half a block, and the rain was light, and the afternoon was cold, and it was enough. The weeks after the Meridian were not clean. Sophia had understood, somewhere in the abstract, that the dismantling of Damien's operation would not feel like a movie ending. No single moment of resolution, no clear line between before and after. What she had not fully anticipated was the texture of it, the specific grinding work of aftermath. Damien Cross was arraigned on federal charges that included conspiracy to commit economic espionage, wire fraud, and interference with the defense procurement process. His attorneys were expensive and immediate and very skilled at finding the procedural surfaces that slowed everything down. I was released on a bond that most people would spend 3 lifetimes unable to post, and he walked out of the federal courthouse in the same charcoal suit he'd been wearing when they brought him in, and he did not look at any camera, which was the most disciplined thing Sophia had ever seen a man do. Pavel Stroud, Ashby's representative, did not make bail. The documentation package he and Damien had assembled in room 32 of the Meridian, 187 pages of pattern engine core architecture, photographed from a company-issued device and compiled into a transfer package, was in federal custody. It constituted, the investigators told Sophia in a follow-up briefing that lasted 3 hours, one of the most complete cases of attempted foreign technology acquisition they had processed in 4 years. The word attempted was doing significant work in that sentence. The attempt had not succeeded. The pattern engine had not transferred. The government evaluation of the Sentinel protocol was paused, formally pending investigation, but had not been terminated, and Helen Birch had communicated through channels that Vantage's position regarding the contract remained, in her word, favorable. Daniel Reyes resigned on a Monday morning. He came to Sophia's office before 8 a.m., before most of the floor had arrived, and sat across from her desk and put an envelope on the desk and looked at his hands. He didn't try to explain himself. That was the thing she remembered afterward. He sat there and he looked at his hands and he said, "I'm sorry, Sophia. I know that doesn't cover it, but I am." She looked at the envelope, at him, at the way his shoulders were carrying something that was not going to lift in any visible future. "Your wife," she said. "Is she better?" He looked up. He hadn't expected that to be the first thing she said. Yes. The treatment worked. She's in remission." "Good," Sophia said. "I mean that." He looked at her for a moment. His jaw moved. "I didn't want to. I need you to know that I kept telling myself I'd find another way, and then the bills were—" He stopped. "There's no version of this where I wasn't wrong. I just need you to know it wasn't easy." "I know," she said. And she did. She had known since Ethan had said it. Good man, bad decision, unbearable pressure. Those 3 things could occupy the same person simultaneously, and the coexistence of them did not resolve neatly into either innocence or villainy. It just sat there, in all its human complexity, demanding to be looked at without the comfort of a simple verdict. "I've cooperated fully with the investigators," he said. "Everything I gave them, everything Damien's people asked me to access, every communication, every instruction. It's all documented." "I know that too." He picked up the envelope and put it back down. He stood up. He looked older than he'd looked 2 weeks ago, which was not a casual observation. There was something in his face that had shifted from the inside out, the specific aging that happens when a person stops spending energy on a thing they'd been maintaining. "Daniel." He stopped at the door. She looked at him. "Get your wife out of the city for a while. Go somewhere you've been meaning to go. Take some time." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're not going to make this into something it isn't," he said. Not a question. "No," she said. "But I'm also not going to make it into less than it is. You'll have to figure out how to carry it. That's going to take more time than you think." She paused. "But you did cooperate, and that matters. It doesn't erase it. It matters anyway." He left. She sat at her desk for a while without moving. She thought about something Ethan had said in a different context, about the difference between what pressure reveals and what it creates. "Pressure doesn't make a person into something they aren't," he'd said. "It shows you what's already there. The parts that hold and the parts that don't. The question is what you build from the information once the pressure is gone." She had been thinking about that for 2 weeks. The board meeting happened on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the Meridian. Full board, in person, the long conference table on the 14th floor that she had sat at hundreds of times, and which felt different today in a way she couldn't attribute to any physical change in the room. Raymond Cho opened the meeting instead of Sophia, which had been his idea and which she had agreed to, because Raymond carrying the first words felt right in a way that was hard to articulate, but that she understood had something to do with accountability being given its proper weight rather than being papered over. Raymond stood at the head of the table and said, "I want to acknowledge before we begin that several members of this board, myself included, allowed our judgment to be influenced by a coordinated campaign of misinformation. We didn't do our due diligence on the source of that information. We put pressure on our CEO at exactly the moment she needed the board's support. And we did it because we were scared and because the pressure we were receiving was sophisticated and because—" He paused, and he was not a man who paused easily. "Because it's easier to doubt someone you trust than to accept that someone is trying to manipulate you. I regret that. I want to say that out loud before we discuss anything else." No one at the table spoke for a moment. Then Sophia said, "Thank you, Raymond. Can we move to the agenda?" She ran the meeting the way she'd run every meeting, prepared, precise, willing to sit in uncomfortable silence when a question deserved more than a quick answer. The agenda covered the federal investigation status, the Vantage contract evaluation, the Sentinel protocol documentation security review that Cass Freeman had already completed and rebuilt, the question of the CFO vacancy, and the forward operating plan for the next 2 quarters. It took 4 hours. By the end of it, the board had voted unanimously to reaffirm her leadership, which the press release would later describe as a demonstration of confidence in executive continuity, and which felt to Sophia, sitting in that room, less like vindication and more like the restoration of something that should never have been in question, which was not the same thing, and she was not going to pretend it was. After the meeting, when the room had cleared and she was standing at the window looking out at the city, the gray water of Puget Sound visible between buildings, the slow movement of a container ship somewhere in the distance, Raymond came and stood beside her. "Your father would have handled this exactly the way you did," he said. She looked at the water. "I don't know about that. My father trusted people more easily than I do. He would have caught it earlier because he wouldn't have spent 3 months managing the appearance of having it under control." Raymond was quiet for a moment. "Maybe. Or maybe he would have done what you did because you're more like him than you think, which is that you found the right person to trust when you needed to, and you trusted them completely." He looked at her. "Who is Ethan Cole?" The investigators mentioned him in their briefing. She looked at Raymond. "A mechanic. On Rainier Avenue." Raymond waited, clearly expecting more. "He sat in the corner at Grounded on a Tuesday morning and didn't look away when he should have," she said. That's the whole story. Raymond absorbed this in the way of a man who understood that he was not going to get more and was choosing to find that sufficient. The criminal case against Damian Cross moved at the pace of federal litigation, which was to say, slowly, thoroughly, and in ways that generated regular calls from her attorney that she had to carve out time for. The attorneys were cautiously optimistic, which was how federal attorneys said things were going well without committing to a timeline. The case against Stroud moved faster. He had begun cooperating within the first week, which the investigators had described as significant, which Sophia understood to mean that the threads leading toward Ashby's broader network were being pulled carefully and systematically. Victor Ashby himself remained abroad, in jurisdictions that complicated extradition, behind layers of legal distance that had protected him for 20 years. The investigation was ongoing. That was the accurate description and also the frustrating one. Ongoing meant not finished. Ongoing meant Marcus Webb's kids were still 13 and 15, and whatever Ethan carried about, that was still carried. She had tried to say something about this to Ethan 2 weeks after the Meridian, when she had driven to the shop and found him under the same Subaru wagon that had been on the lift when she'd first walked in. She wondered briefly if it was actually the same car, and then decided not to ask. She crouched down next to the lift. "Ethan." He pushed the creeper out. He sat up. He looked at her with the patient expression of a man who had gotten used to her appearing at his shop unannounced, which she acknowledged was a habit she had developed without exactly deciding to develop it. "Ashby is still out there," she said. "I've been thinking about whether that— I know he's still out there. Does that—" She stopped, trying to find the right word. "Does it what?" He stood up, wiped his hands on the shop rag. "Does it feel like it wasn't enough? What we did? He looked at her for a moment. He threw the rag onto the workbench and leaned against the side of the lift. Stroud is in custody, he said. The documentation package is in federal hands. The investigation has more active threads going into Ashby's network right now than it's had in 6 years. Damian Cross is facing federal prosecution. Your company is intact. He looked at the floor, then back at her. Is it enough? No. Is it more than existed a month ago? Yes. I've learned to measure things that way. Not against the whole unfinished truth, against the position you were in before. She looked at him. That's a hard way to live. It's the accurate way, he said. The whole unfinished truth is going to be unfinished for a while. Maybe a long while. Sitting around waiting for it to be complete before you decide if anything was worth doing. He shook his head. You'd never decide anything was worth doing. She thought about that for a while. She was still thinking about it 3 weeks later when the Vantage contract renewal came through, formally, with a federal note attached that described the government's confidence in the Sentinel Protocol's security architecture and the integrity of the company's leadership. And she sat in her office and read the document twice and felt something that was not triumphant exactly, but that was solid in a way that triumph often wasn't. 412 people still had jobs. The technology her father had built the company to protect was still in the hands he would have wanted it in. The thing that had been constructed against her, piece by piece, over 4 months, was coming apart piece by piece in return. It was enough. It was genuinely enough. And she was learning to let that be true without immediately moving to the next problem. She sent Ethan a text. 2 words. It's through. His response came 40 minutes later, which meant he'd been under a car. Good. That was it. That was the whole exchange. She sat at her desk and looked at it and found herself smiling, which was something she hadn't done at her desk and she actually couldn't remember some. The foundation was not Sophia's idea exactly. It arrived the way the better ideas in her life had usually arrived, sideways, through a conversation about something else. It was a Saturday in late November and she was at the shop again, which had become a pattern she had stopped pretending to herself was purely professional. She had arrived with coffee from Grounded, 2 dark roasts, no room, which had become the specific order without either of them discussing it. And Lily had been there because it was a Saturday, working on what she described as a very important drawing at the kitchen table and periodically asking Sophia for opinions on color choices with the seriousness of someone managing a significant creative project. Sophia had given opinions. She had been informed that her suggestion of blue for the horse was correct, but that she had been wrong about the tree, which should obviously be orange. Sophia had accepted this. Ethan had come up from the shop, and they had sat at the kitchen table with their coffees and Lily between them, and at some point the conversation had moved from the Vantage contract to the CFO search to something else, and Sophia had said, not planning to say it, just saying it, I've been thinking about Daniel, about what happens to people when they're in financial crisis and they don't have anywhere to go. How that specific combination of desperation and isolation is how people like Damien find their leverage. Ethan had looked at her over his coffee cup. Most of the people Damien used in this whole operation, she continued, weren't bad people. Marcus Hale, whatever history he had with Damien. Daniel, the board members who got scared, he didn't find villains. He found people at their most vulnerable, and he applied pressure at exactly the right point. She paused. That's what I can't stop thinking about. What are you going to do about it? Ethan said, not skeptically, genuinely asking. I don't know yet. She looked at Lily's drawing. The orange tree was taking shape with extraordinary commitment. Something. I don't know what the shape of it is yet. What the shape of it turned out to be was a foundation. Not launched with fanfare, not announced at a press conference, built quietly over the following 4 months with the same methodical attention she gave everything she built. The Whitmore Foundation for Professional Resilience, a name she was not entirely happy with and intended to revisit, provided emergency financial assistance, counseling resources, and legal support to professionals who were being financially coerced or were in crisis situations that made them vulnerable to exactly the kind of leverage Damien Cross had spent his career applying. It was not a grand gesture. It was not going to change the fundamental architecture of how power operated in corporate environments. She was under no illusions about that. What it was going to do was ensure that a certain number of people, in the specific situation Daniel Reyes had been in, had somewhere to go and someone to call before they made the decision that couldn't be unmade. That was the whole scope of it. She was comfortable with that scope. She told Ethan about it on a Wednesday morning at the kitchen table. She laid out the structure, the funding, the operating plan. He listened the way he listened to everything, completely and without performance. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You're going to need someone who understands coercion from the inside," he said. "Not a corporate consultant. Someone who has actually been in situations where the pressure was real and the options looked non-existent." She looked at him. I'm not volunteering for a job," he said quickly, with the particular alarm of a man who had suddenly understood how his words were going to land. "I know that. I have a shop. I have Lily. I'm not looking to go—" "Ethan," she looked at him steadily, "I wasn't going to offer you a job. I was going to ask if you'd be willing to speak with people, occasionally, on a consultative basis. When someone comes to the foundation who is in a situation where your specific experience would help them understand their options." She paused. "You'd be a volunteer, with absolute discretion over when and whether you participate. Lily would always come first." He looked at his coffee cup. He turned it slightly on the table. "What would I say to them?" he said. "I'm a mechanic." "You'd tell them what you told me," she said, "that pressure doesn't define them, that what they do under it is a choice even when it doesn't feel like one, that the isolation is constructed and they're not as alone as they've been made to feel." She looked at him. "You said all of that to me over 3 weeks in this kitchen, and it was more useful than anything my attorneys or my PR team or my board said combined." He looked at the window. Outside, the November sky was its familiar gray, the specific Seattle gray that wasn't depressing once you stopped fighting it and just accepted it as the particular color of this place. "Occasionally," he said. "Occasionally. With full discretion. Complete." He looked back at her. "Okay." She nodded. She picked up her coffee. He picked up his. Lily appeared from the living room with the orange tree drawing, now completed, and presented it to Sophia with the gravity of an artist delivering a finished work. "It's for you," Lily said, "because you keep coming over." Sophia looked at the drawing. The orange tree. The purple horse in the background with its confident 6 legs. A figure next to the tree that, she realized, was wearing a jacket. "Thank you," Sophia said. And she meant it in a way that went beyond the drawing itself, in the way that small offerings from people who don't yet know the full weight of what they're offering sometimes carry more meaning than anything deliberate. The first snow of the year came in early December, which was unusual for Seattle, and the city did what it always did with unusual snow, which was to treat it as a minor collective crisis. Schools delayed, buses rerouted, people stood on sidewalks looking at the inch of white cover with the expression of people who had been told a thing was possible and were now confronted with its actuality. Grounded was warm and fogged and smelled like espresso and wood smoke from the small decorative fireplace that only ran in winter. Sophia arrived first and took the same table by the window she'd sat at in October, which she had not consciously decided to take, and then had consciously decided to keep once she realized she'd done it. She ordered 2 dark roasts, no room. Ethan came in at 7:18, which was 4 minutes later than she'd expected, which she knew because she had started having a sense of what his punctuality looked like. He shook a small amount of snow off his jacket before he came in. He sat across from her. He looked at the second coffee, already there, and something in his face shifted in the way it shifted when he encountered consideration he hadn't planned for. "Snow," she said. "Yeah." He wrapped his hands around the cup. "Lily thinks it's the best thing that's ever happened. She was outside in it at 6 this morning." "Naturally." "She made something. She said it was a snowman, but structurally it was more of a snow situation." Sophia laughed. An actual unguarded laugh. It surprised her a little. Ethan looked at her. He almost smiled. They sat for a moment. The cafe was quiet in the specific way it was quiet before the morning properly arrived. A handful of people, the soft collision of cups and conversation, the city outside just beginning to stir under its thin white cover. "I've been thinking," Sophia said, about the fact that I came in here 10 weeks ago looking for 5 minutes of quiet, and instead my life changed substantially." He looked at his coffee. "Mine too." She looked at him. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the table, at the cup, at some middle distance that she had come to understand was where he went when he was being honest about something and needed a second to make sure he meant it before he said it. "Is that okay?" she said. The way it changed. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a car moved slowly through the snow-dusted street, careful and deliberate. I spent 6 years, he said, getting very good at a life that didn't take up much space. Not because I wanted a small life, because small felt manageable, contained. He turned the cup slightly. And then you came to the shop and you put a folder on the desk and you looked at me like you'd already decided I could do something and you just needed me to figure that out He stopped. It reminded me that contained isn't the same as safe, and manageable isn't the same as good. She looked at him. So yes, he said. It's okay. He looked up at her. It's more than okay. The morning light came through the fogged window in the pale, diffuse way of light through December glass, and it fell across the table between them without any particular drama, without the cinematic weight that moments like this tend to carry in the stories people tell about them afterward. It was just light. They were just two people with coffee on a snowy morning, each of them carrying their specific damage and their specific capacity and sitting, without performance, in the same room. That was the thing about the way things actually happened, Sophia thought, as opposed to the way you expected them to happen or the way they would be described later. The moments that changed things rarely announced themselves. They didn't arrive with a signal or a clear demarcation point. They were just a door opening, a person sitting down, a man in a corner booth placing his coffee cup back on the table with a quiet deliberateness that, in another version of the world, no one would have noticed. She had spent a long time, longer than 4 months if she was honest, probably most of her adult life, believing that the way you earned safety was by being sufficient. Sufficient at your job, sufficient in your understanding of risk, sufficient at not needing things you couldn't afford to need. It was not a bad strategy exactly. It had taken her a long way. But it was a strategy built around the assumption that the only reliable variable was herself, and that everything else, people, circumstances, the particular moral luck of encountering the right person at the right moment, was too unstable to build on. Ethan had not cured her of this. She was still that person, in most of the ways that mattered. She still prepared obsessively. She still arrived early. She still ran the room. But she had learned, in a specific and irreversible way, that there was a category of protection that you could not provide for yourself. Not because you were inadequate, but because some attacks are designed for exactly the person you are, for your competence, your pride, your unwillingness to show the fracture lines. And the only answer to that kind of targeted pressure was another person who could see you clearly enough to know where the fracture lines were and stand next to them anyway. She had not known she needed that. She had known she was without it. Those were not the same. Across the table, Ethan was watching the street through the fogged window. He held his coffee cup with both hands the way he always did. He had a new cut on a different knuckle, the kind of small occupational damage that came with working with your hands, constant and unremarkable, the body keeping its record of the work you did. He was not the easiest person she had ever known. He answered questions he chose to answer and left others in the particular silence that was his version of a closed door. He forgot things that weren't Lily. He had told her once about missing a dentist appointment 3 times in a row before Lily's school sent home a reminder that children's health care was parental responsibility, which had been the actual prompt, and he worked hours that were only partially explained by the demands of the shop. He carried weight he did not distribute and was not going to. She understood that. She did not think she was going to change it, and she had examined herself carefully enough to know that her interest in it was not driven by the belief that she could. What she thought, in the way you think things you are not quite ready to say out loud, was that she was tired of sitting at tables alone, and that sitting across from someone who understood the difference between what pressure reveals and what it creates, who could look at a complicated situation and see its structure rather than just its surface, who had held his daughter's jacket zipper with the same hands that had made 2 trained men stop moving, sitting across from that person, at this table, on a snowy December morning in a city that was handling the snow badly, was the version of not alone that she found she wanted. She didn't say any of this. She picked up her coffee. Lily's Christmas list, she said. Has she given it to you yet? He looked back from the window. She's given me 3 separate and contradictory versions, he said, each one presented as definitive. I've stopped trying to reconcile them. Smart. She's 7. The list changes based on what show she watched most recently. He looked at his cup. Last week she wanted a professional stand mixer because the competition show had one. I'm not putting a stand mixer in the hands of a 7-year-old. That seems like a reasonable position. She disagreed, strongly. Did she make her case? He looked up. Something in his face was doing the almost smile thing. She listed 3 specific recipes she planned to make. With estimated time and required ingredients, she had a visual aid. Sophia stared at him. She made a presentation. She made a presentation, Ethan confirmed. I don't know where she gets that. Sophia looked at him for a moment. He looked back. I might know where she gets that, she said. He looked at his coffee. The almost smile completed itself. It was a real one, small and unannounced, there and then tucked away, the way he kept things that mattered. Outside, the snow continued its patient, unhurried work on the city. The morning arrived fully, and the cafe filled by degrees, and the day began its ordinary business. And at a table by the window, 2 people sat with their coffee going cold in the comfortable way coffee goes cold when you're no longer counting the minutes. Nobody looked twice at them. Nobody would have had any reason to. A woman in a good coat, a man in a worn jacket, 2 cups, a window. The snow outside doing what snow does, covering the familiar shapes of things, not erasing them, just changing how the light fell across them, making the ordinary world look briefly like something you were seeing for the first time. That was enough. That had always been enough. The trick, it turned out, was just being willing to look.